the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. The 90s are back in fashion. A couple of weeks ago, we did a show with the historian Terry H. Anderson. Why the 90s Matter. His Oxford University Press is Oxford University Press book is intriguing in explaining or arguing why the 90s matter. And now we have another book on the 90s, this time suggesting that the 90s really matter in terms of the 2020s in America. It's by my guest, John Ganz. When the Clock Broke, Conmen, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990s. John is joining us from the Upper East Side in New York City. John, congratulations on the new book. It's getting rave reviews in both the New York Times and the Washington Post. Does that worry you a bit?
Well, I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop, Andrew. I'm sure someone's going to take a crack at me pretty soon.
There's always going to be another shoe. But in all seriousness, John, I read both reviews. They're both very good, but they're very convenient, or it's a very convenient book for explaining the 2020s. And you don't seem to be the kind of fellow who is interested in convenient explanations.
No, I think, well, look, in the case of a newspaper review, there's only so much they can get to in terms of talking about the book. I don't think that this book is meant to provide an easy package to explain how we got to where we were. My vision for the book was to sort of guide readers on a different way or a more rigorous way of reading a political moment. And it's my belief that if you look at the fringes of a society, and particularly what's going on in politics and sometimes what's going on in culture, you can kind of get a vision of the future. So I believed there were a lot of different elements floating around at the time of the period that I was researching that were quite suggestive and sort of did come together with the person of Donald Trump. But I don't think he's going to be the last incarnation of that, or this is a kind of teleological history ending with him. It's just a convenient starting and stopping place.
Your book, in some ways, begins with David Duke. We did a show on Duke with his godson or daughter, son, Derek Black. Derek Black, who has a new book out. I'm sure you're familiar. Klansman's son. Why did you begin with Duke? Why is he more than just a fringe figure in your view in terms of the 90s?
Well, David Duke, I thought, marked something really remarkable, which was that at the end of the Cold War, when the United States is supposed to be triumphant and liberalism and democracy is supposed to be triumphant, a professed and a one-time professed, but then slightly veiled neo-Nazi was able to become a viable candidate for governor in a state in the United States. He lost, but he won a majority of the white vote. And the other reason why he was a major figure, he sort of inaugurates the book, is that the other figures in my book, Pat Buchanan, Sam Francis, kind of the brain of Pat Buchanan, you might say, or one of the brains of Pat Buchanan, might say, saw Duke's successes as a signal of the viability of their own politics. And there was something to that interpretation. Now, of course, they also did not succeed but they show that this local revolt, if you want to put it that way, had some national legs, and it took a very long time for it to really get going. But that was basically the reason why they thought Duke was a very the rest of the country was very frightened. They saw in Duke a very hopeful sign.
You, of course, talk about Buchanan, many other figures on the right, and you address this in the book, and you acknowledge that that none of this is profoundly new, or none of this was profoundly new in American history in terms of the 90s. Obviously, a long history of the Klan, of race war, of civil war, of slavery. What happened in the early 90s, John, that's different from previous moments in American history?
Well, I believe in certain ways it's a return to things that were happening in the United States prior to World War II and prior to the Cold War. I believe that the orientation of the United States towards foreign enemies and the way the United States economy was structured after the war and during the Cold War, before, during, after the war, during the Cold War, sort of kept a lid on these other features. Of course, there was a violent reaction to the civil rights movement, but the narrative of the United States from the end of the war up until the 1980s, was that we were basically progressing in terms of race. The country would be ever more prosperous, ever more equal, provide people with opportunities. And that story begins to break down at the end of the 1980s. Reagan still talks about the United States as a kind of as the shining city on the hill, where everybody wants to come, and still speaks of democracy as a good thing. A right winger speaking of democracy is a good thing. And there are many people to the right of Ronald Reagan who don't share that vision, and they begin to get a much wider national hearing. They begin to use slogans that you would have heard before the World War II, and you don't hear very much in the Cold War era, things like America First. So it is a change. It's a new inauguration of a new era. But I think for many of the people in my book, it's a return, hopefully a return to an earlier America before the New Deal, before the war, before the civil rights movement, and a country that they longed for, even though they may have not even experienced it.
Of course, there are many Americas before the New Deal. I mean, it could be we've done shows on Coolidge, for example, Calvin Coolidge, who was nostalgic for a supposedly bucolic agricultural America of the 19th century.
Sure.
When we think of this nostalgia that began to reappear in the early 90s, was Duke, or is Duke, or even Buchanan, were they nostalgists, or were they just angry racists?
Well, it's difficult to speak of nostalgia because, obviously the vision that they have of the past is a mythological and idealized one, right? So it's nothing that actually exists. Buchanan, well, David Duke was nostalgic for the Third Reich, quite frankly. Buchanan had very positive things to say.
For it, didn't he?
Yeah.
Although he
did
changed his dress a bit, but he used to like to put, I don't know if he still does, probably privately, put on the Nazi uniform.
Yeah, he tries to not do that in public. That's
I bet he's doing it in private, John, though, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure he gets together with his buddies and does it. But yeah, I think, Buchanan had positive things to say about the 1950s and the conservatism that decade represented in his mind. But yes, to a certain degree, their images of the white past in America are highly idealized. They are ideological fictions that are supposed to present to their crowds, a vision of a better time. This is a type of rhetoric. It's not reflective of actual experience. And it's often extremely eclectic. They mix longing for the period of Coolidge and the period before the New Deal, And then they go back and talk about the founders, and they're especially have a lot of
John,
nice things to say. Antebellum America, and don't care for Lincoln and the way Lincoln transformed the country. Yeah.
But I don't need to tell you this. We're muddled creatures, not always as clear as we'd like to be, and we don't always know how clear we want to be. Is there anything insane? I mean, you talk about how America cracked up in the early 90s in this reaction against social democracy. The title of the book, When the Clock Broke, is borrowed from Rothbard. We will break the clock of social democracy. I'm sure I'm in your camp. I'm sympathetic to social democracy, but there's nothing insane about turning the clock back, is there? It's not cracked up to say, well, there was an enormous opposition to FDR in the 30s and 40s. So why is this madness?
Well, I think it's madness because the country cannot function in that way anymore. We don't live in a mostly agrarian society. We live in a post-industrial society. The longing to return to this previous dispensation is not a realistic one. It's one that lives in fantasy. I think that its vision of power and what is to be done with it once it's captured, its reshaping of the country is trying to remake America according to their own imaginations. And in fact, I think they quite hate the country as it actually looks. America is a very big and diverse place. Lots of different kinds of people who look very differently and think very differently and have different kinds of views. But that's not really America to them. Their vision of America is very specific, and I think it's hallucinatory, and some people share it. But that's why I would say it verges on madness, is that it just does not cope in certain ways with the reality of the country as it is. Now, that being said, perhaps that madness or that hallucinatory quality or that fantasy quality is what gives its appeal as well. So I don't think that, unfortunately, that doesn't marginalize it so much as make it something desirable for a lot of people.
Isn't that what politics is, though? I mean, it even seems to be attracting people of different color skins. I mean, this Trumpian moment we're in, according to you at least, found its origins at the early 90s. David Duke, Pat Buchanan, neither of whom were particularly keen on people of different color skins. But now, young black men, young Hispanic men seem to be in some ways embracing this Trumpian nostalgia. So isn't that what politics is, John? That's just who we are. We are, I can't remember the exact Kant quote, but we are a crooked timber.
Nothing ever straight came out of the crooked timber of humanity or something like that. Yeah, I think that's true. Hannah Arendt has a wonderful description about politics where she says lying is intrinsic to politics in a certain way because politics always believes it can change and alter the world. It's an active stance towards the world. There is a point at which politics will always contain a vision, always contain a desire to change the world. And that is not necessarily a negative thing. I believe, for my own reasons and for my sense of patriotism, what I think the country should be, that the particular vision of these,
probably,
that might have something to do with it. That the particular vision in question is not as a destructive one. And a negative one. But yes, of course, I mean, politics must have, I think that this is a problem actually with politics as it's practiced by the establishment. And I have a certain admiration, I think you might be able to detect reading the book, for the imagination of these figures, for the fact that they're willing to envision different futures. And even when they do seem to me cracked, they are visionaries. And I sometimes regret that the political establishment in the United States doesn't share that imaginative faculty.
Yeah, especially certain Joseph Biden. We're talking with John Ganz, the author of When the Clocks Broke, major new book, and one of America's leading political, cultural writers, critics. The book is just out, When the Clock Broke, Con Men, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990s. When it comes to disorder, I want to thank our friends at the Disorder podcast for bringing great guests like John Ganz. Going to run a short piece about disorder, and then we'll be back with John. I want to talk specifically about how this affected the Republican Party and indeed the Democratic Party in the 1990s. So we'll be back in a second. Don't go away, anyone.
The chaos in the news every day, and that we lurch from one crisis to the next without any coherent vision from our leaders. I find Starmer so inspiring and so messianic. It is his non-messianic personality which is messianic. At Goalhanger's Disorder podcast, we're tired of people who harp on the negatives with no solutions. We try to order the disorder.
We will likely have a government that wants to do more in terms of supporting international law.
Over the next few weeks, we're going to see how July's result could impact Britain's role in the world and change everything in the US elections. I am just so excited because Biden has not been doing so great. This is something that's going to be giving him 1 to 2 point difference in places like Michigan when Starmer comes in with a 60 or an 80 seat majority. Search Disorder in your podcast app to listen right now.
As one of the best new podcasts, Disorder, presented by my friend Jason Pack. We are speaking with another man who's been thinking about disorder, but the disorder of the 1990s, John Ganz, the author of When the Clock Broke. John, how did this affect the Republican Party itself? I think this is one of the great debates. Did this, so to speak, this what you define as a kind of insanity on the right, this absurd, unrealistic nostalgia, did it infect the George H.W. Bushes of the world?
Well, yes, I just want to pull back for a little bit. I think Crack Up, although it obviously has, some mental health redolence, is not precisely, I don't mean to say that they are literally insane. I mean, I figuratively speaking, yes, we can call it insane. I'm not saying they all went mad in a clinical way. Okay, but to your question, yes. So the Republican establishment, and this is why I think it's very interesting to look back, and when you look back at their challenges with Trump, really struggled to fight off David Duke's insurgency, even though he should have been, a very minor figure. They were very frightened by it when he was even running as a local politician in Louisiana for a state legislator seat. And they put the full firepower of the RNC against him, and they couldn't get rid of him. And then he won his nomination for governor with the same difficulty. So he showed a certain weakness of the establishment of the Republican Party. Buchanan showed that weakness modeling himself on Duke explicitly. He showed that weakness was even deeper. And then the Republican Party, the establishment of the Republican Party, essentially, after a primary season where they're attempting to call Buchanan a Nazi and an anti-Semite and a fascist and associate him with David Duke, fairly for the most part, they invite him into the Republican National Convention. I mean, he's a long-standing member of the conservative movement, worked in Republican White Houses, but they invite him to the convention to give a primetime speech. It's a controversial speech, a very historically memorable speech. So what does it say about a political party that doesn't view its coalition as viable without the guy that they had just been calling, the reincarnation of David Duke and Adolf Hitler for the past 6 months? I think it shows that they think that they can't win without those sorts of people, and they need those sorts of people.
The standard narrative, John, of the 90s is, in terms of warning about right-wing politics, and I think this is something that Terry Anderson pursues, is the role of Newt Gingrich. I first saw the book, I thought, this is going to be another book about Gingrich. Gingrich is not central. How do you place him? Is he closer to Dole or David Duke?
I think he's somewhere right in the middle. There's been so much wonderful stuff written about Gingrich, and yes, his demagoguery and the way he was extremely polarizing. I think I don't have any quarrel with people who connect Gingrich very closely with developments in Republican politics since. But as you said, everybody pays attention to Gingrich. I just felt, he had been written about by my friend Nikki Hemmer in her book. He's been written about in Steve Kornacki's book. So I just thought Gingrich had already been done a little bit. And also my book ends around 1993. Obviously Gingrich is making a name for himself in Republican politics, but his domination of Republican politics really begins in 1994. So he's a sort of creature of the next moment, but you can see he's taking notes, and he does appear in the book. He's kind of like Trump in the book, which is, I don't know, one of these characters in the background who's lurking, and in a later episode reasserts themselves as if it was kind of a Balzac novel. And a couple novels down the road, that person might be the protagonist. Not to compare myself to Balzac.
Yeah, well, the worst comparisons.
Yeah.
One of the things about the Anderson book that reminded me that I'd forgotten about the 90s, it's so easy to forget it, although we shouldn't, is the role of violence on the right wing. People like Buchanan and Rothbard and Duke, how much did they fetishize right-wing violence against the state? The standoffs at Ruby Ridge and the other massacres of the 90s really marked the beginning, perhaps, of an almost informal war between right-wing militants and the FBI and the state. Can you take this back when the clock broke?
Sure. So basically, yes, Pat Buchanan, David Duke, certainly. I mean, he comes from that underworld and is always kind of trying to make a more respectable side of it. And especially this figure who I write about a great deal, Sam Francis, who wrote an article in the 1980s, who thought that the rise of neo-Nazi violence was an extremely interesting and positive sign for the right, because it showed their development as a self-conscious movement that was willing to fight and die for its beliefs. So he greeted that kind of stuff with a certain amount of grim enthusiasm. And Buchanan has always been the kind of mainstream candidate that comes closest to speaking the language of this netherworld of right-wing extremists, and they know it, and he knows it. He said, the biggest vacuum in American politics is to the right of Ronald Reagan. And he sought to occupy it. And his candidacy was greeted by prominent figures in the Ku Klux Klan and contributors
so it was
to
the Nixonian wolf whistle. People, you're suggesting that when Buchanan said something, he suggesting violence against the state, or perhaps half joking about it. Buchanan has a good sense of humor, that everybody knew what he was saying.
Yes, I believe that he knew that he was signaling to this constituency, which he thought was actually significant and not merely a fringe, but had some political weight, that he was one of them. And he did it on multiple occasions. Now, his invocations of violence usually are kind of wrapped up in the state, like in his cultural war speech. It's the military, the National Guard taking our country back. But, other figures that I write about were much more open in the fact that they believed that the federal government represented a completely illegitimate plot against the American people, that armed resistance was an understandable and desirable tactic to use in politics.
I mean, Buchanan, he began his political career as a speechwriter for Nixon. Does that imply in a way that this, if you want to call it a cancer, existed in the Republican Party, that it was, if not inevitable, certainly not unsurprising?
I think, his relationship with Richard Nixon is very interesting. So, Richard Nixon was not popular with the conservative movement insofar it centered around, National View, Buckley, Human Events, and so on and so forth. Richard Nixon was viewed as a centrist Republican, establishment Republican, a pragmatist, not a reliable man of the right. Buchanan was almost the attaché of the conservative movement to Nixon. And what Buchanan saw in Nixon as a right-winger, and maybe not even a conservative, but as a radical right-winger, as he became, was something very distinctive. This was a tribune of the forgotten middle Americans, and he knew Nixon intimately. So he didn't see Nixon only speaking presidentially. He saw the Nixon of the tapes, the paranoid Nixon the anti-Semite, Nixon who hated liberals, and thought, this guy is one of us. And he, very interesting, his reaction to Watergate. He believed that Watergate was essentially a coup of establishment liberals, elites, against this tribune of middle American populism. And Nixon's mistake, the lost opportunity of Watergate, was not to initiate some sort of counter coup. How literally he meant that, I leave it to the reader's imagination, but I believe he meant it, quite literally. And that was his reading, his right-wing reading of Nixon. And why he insisted much, and differed with many of his colleagues who he respected. I mean, he was he looked up to Buckley as well, who was never enamored of Richard Nixon. But Buchanan saw him as a seminal figure on the American right and an important development. And similarly, Reagan, he looked up to, worked in the Reagan administration. He had an enormous amount of respect for Reagan. He looked up to Reagan, but again, he viewed Iran-Contra as a way for the liberal establishment to kind of stymie a right-wing Republican administration. So Buchanan's hope with these presidential figures was always for a kind of, how shall we put it, a strong man, a Caesar type figure who would assert themselves in the face of, the morass of Washington elites.
And meanwhile, let's end on this, John. Well, the right is reinventing itself. Your subtitles talks about cracking up, but as you acknowledge, it's not really a form of madness. It's probably the business of politics. What the establishment, mainstream politicians, particularly progressives, what were they doing? I mean, Chuck Klosterman's classic book, The 90s, is a book about the invention of the internet and grunge music and having a lot of fun. We know all the stories of Clinton. Some were writing about the end of history, like Fukuyama. Is there the other side of the coin here, the other shoe that drops? Just as the right is in the business of the early 90s of reinventing itself, of understanding, perhaps unconsciously, that the world was about to radically change, progressives did absolutely nothing. They just stood still.
I don't think that's true. I will leave it to another writer to tell that story, or maybe
another book by you. It'd be an interesting
counter. Yeah, I think a lot of interesting things were going on the left and among progressives. I mean, obviously, a lot of the things that conservatives decry about the culture wars coming on the left have their roots in the late 80s and early 90s. Political correctness is obviously, an earlier incarnation of what they would call wokeness, and its effects on culture, for better or worse, have been great. In 1990, Bernie Sanders wins his first statewide race. So even as the Soviet Union is about to collapse, some reinterpretation of socialism is still reemerging or beginning to assert itself. There are many, and there are interesting things going on with Jesse Jackson's campaigns in the 80s that people have tried to emulate with more or less success. I don't want it. My feeling about the left at the time, though, I must say, is that it was weak. It was caught off guard by the changes of the time. And I believe a thesis of my book is that the side with the more revolutionary vision, unfortunately, was the right. And that's sort of why we're living in the world we are. But I'm sure there's much, much more interesting things to say about the left of this era than I'm able to.
And of course, we did a show a couple of weeks ago about the World Trade Organization riots in Seattle in 1999. So you had in a way, if not a similar, certainly an equivalent response to globalization. Just as you had Duke and Buchanan on the right, you had anti-globalization, anti-World Trade Organization demonstrators on the left. So finally, John, how should we remember the 90s? Or how will the 90s will be remembered? Or how do you want us to remember the 90s, given this new book, When the Clock Broke?
I hope that people will not turn to the past and, and see kind of gauzy, cliched images. I hope that they will remember figures that have been relegated to the fringes or forgotten or thought of as kooks or curiosities, and can see in them reflections of the present and intimations of what may come. I hope that the 90s will be remembered as, not merely a time of security and that we're all nostalgic for, but, as a really complicated historical period that the interpretation of has just begun. And my book is just part of that process.
Can I step on the scene?